So I'm excited to be here today and talk about something that is kind of near and dear to my heart. I'm in my third startup. It's actually 15 years. I was an Idaho farm boy that had an idea to do a business a few years back, and it was for a ski swap online, and that turned into Gear Trade, where we were helping manufacturers and retailers with closeout inventory. We ultimately sold that to backcountry.com, and right at the end of that, we had a distributor say, this whole closeout stuff is great, but what I really need help with is drop shipping. And we're like, what the hell is drop shipping? And we find out that drop shipping is where retailers don't have inventory and it's distributed and dispersed. And we're like, hey, if that worked at scale, you wouldn't have a closeout problem to begin with. And that became Doba, which we bootstrapped to almost 20 million in sales. And then 2 years ago, we decided that wasn't enough, and we said, let's go try to do something even bigger and work on some supply chain software. So I don't know how I went from milking dairy cows in Idaho to this, but I did, and hopefully today I can kind of talk a little bit about this stockpiling the goods, inventory management problem, and it talks about what no one will tell you, and I'll start off by just talking that what nobody tells you is that it's a giant, massive, horrible pain in the ass, and if you look at it worldwide, it's $1.5 trillion in an annual basis is sitting in an overstocked inventory position. That actually manifests itself as $326 billion of actual losses every year. Out of stocks are even a bigger problem. It's $456 billion. So you add this together, you're talking over $800 billion of economic losses around inventory issues in the retail supply chain. The horrible part is that it's growing by $50 billion every year. A lot of that is because emerging economies and things like that. And so that's we'll start with the problem that anybody dealing with inventory has. I want to spend, so kind of three sections. I want to do a little bit of level set, just some of the trends that I think are playing out in the supply chain, and then I want to shift to some tactics, four tactical things about how I think with those trends you can implement into your startups, and then finally finish with kind of three higher level maybe things to think about for the future, and hopefully there's some amount of value in the battle that you guys are all facing. So when you look at why is there this problem, it's traditional retail supply chain, right? There's very defined roles. There's companies who make things, other companies aggregate those things and aggregate people who want to buy things, and then there are consumers who actually do the buying. It's very B2B and B2C focused. There's very defined roles. It's important to remember 90% of the world is this in a physical way. It's customers walking into a physical store that had purchased physical inventory and moved it to that physical store from people who made physical stuff. It's 93% actually averaged out across all product categories. Now that's changing. Well, why is it changing? The first big change is e-commerce came along and really took the POS, the storefront piece of the retail, and virtualized it. So now you can have kind of virtual consumers. So you still have two discrete things. You have a B2B and B2C, but that B2C has changed drastically. But the stockpiling of the goods piece of this equation is nearly identical to everything that's been happening before. The next big evolution from as soon as e-commerce got started and back when I was getting Doba started, there was a huge amount of energy around the idea of taking it one step further and pushing back up the supply chain with virtual product inventory. The economists would write in papers and everything, and that's this next evolution where you create more of a B2B to C chain, and you've taken that consumer and pulled them back up into the supply, and you now have a distributed and dispersed source of supply that is, potentially at least different, if not bigger, than what you had in the pure e-commerce model. Another thing is from the beginning of time, the companies who make things have wanted to get rid of the people selling it, and they just wanted to go direct. Well, again, with the virtualization of that storefront, you bolt that on top of a brand, and now you have a scalable, easier way to go direct. It's always concerned about channel conflict, but with social and the economic crash of 2008, a lot of companies have said, I'm going to go do this and try to go direct. And finally, the corollary of that is if you're a company who sells things, you've always been jonesing to make things. And again, with a virtual storefront tapped onto that business, so you can scale your ability to aggregate consumers in a whole new way. We'll see in a whole new group of companies that are deploying vertically integrated retail and e-commerce strategies, like Bonobos from this morning. You line these things up, and you put them up on a wall, and this is basically the supply chain, the retail supply chain. And two things kind of come out to me, these two trends that are happening, and the first is virtualization. You basically have the virtualization of demand, and to the extent possible, the virtualization of supply and inventory. And you also have the ability to go direct, where you're removing players from the supply chain, or you're creating hybrid models where companies that used to have much more defined roles are starting to do more than one thing. And so that's kind of where things are coming. And as an e-commerce company in this landscape, I like to try to think about getting ahead of the trends. And what you can start to see now is new things playing out, because you're really not talking about these roles. It's not supplier, manufacturer, retailer. It's really it's broader than that. It's about supply, aggregation, and demand. And everything, even on the previous slide, all of those arrows, the T-shirts, are still pushing to the consumer. It's a product push, predictive supply chain. And you're starting to see examples of models that are breaking that and turning it more into a consumer pull and a more reactive supply chain. So you have example of Tom's. They make shoes, sunglasses, and now coffee. But they are using their brand with a virtual storefront bolted on front of it to now sell other people's products. So they've role shifted into an area that they didn't used to do. They didn't used to do that. I think that's going to be a trend, that continues to play out. You have the crowd aggregation factor, where you've taken the role of a consumer, pushed them back upstream into the role of an aggregator. You find examples with like Pinterest and Wanilo that are using the consumers to decide what kinds of products that they should be thinking about, and that aggregation role. And then, finally, you can push it all the way upstream. Threadless, Quirky, and others that are actually using the crowd to decide what to source products. And these trends are starting to move the arrows the other direction. They're starting to flip it onto its head. And I think that will continue to play out. So where do you guys end up as an e-commerce company today? Well, you've got this big macro problem of matching supply and demand. And the pipes of doing that are incredibly inefficient because it's still very physical. And it will always be physical. To some degree, because this thing is real, right? My shirt is real, and so you've got to think about how do you have a strategy to fill the pipes. And from my experience in watching this play out in the last 15 years, the companies that are successful are the ones that are basically trying to figure out how to have a more distributed, nimble, virtual, real-time supply chain. They're trying to get out of the business of making a bad inventory decision that can destroy their company. And the way you have to do this is you have to approach the world in an entirely new way. And all of the ones and zeros in these pipes, what that represents is instead of having to work with 10 vendors or 100 vendors, now you're needing to think about working with 1,000 vendors. And instead of having to work with 3,000 or 4,000 SKUs or 10, now it's in the hundreds of thousands of SKUs, so you can have a big enough haystack to find needles inside of that for your customers. And those trends are driving this scale. And you've gone from this commit to buy world, where it's B2B, I sit across the table, I'm going to buy something, to a commit to integrate. And now I'm just moving information and data around. But what you find is there's churn. There's vendor churn, there's SKU churn, because you don't know. You're trying to let the consumer pull products to them, at an inverse supply chain, instead of pushing and predicting what you're going to kick down in each of the steps. And that's very unknown, so you can cast bigger nets, but it becomes very inefficient. And if this is you, so if you are, anyone in the room, if you have a product, I think you probably are selling directly to the consumer. We surveyed the 1,500 supply sources on our platform across every product category. We think it's a good data set. And 73% of those companies sell direct to the consumer. So these are traditionally brands that didn't do that, and I think this will continue to accelerate. And if that's you, if you can sell to the consumer, there's no reason you can't support other virtual demand channels as a provider of products, because it's the same. It's the logistics, it's dealing with the customer. And so I think you want to think about filling up your pipes, and you need to think about penetrating your channels 100%. It should never be less than 100%, not with the web. And if this is you and you are a retailer and you're trying to find things to buy, at least as piece of your strategy, you should look at the evolution of that slide just before this one and say most of the companies that I'm going to be selling their products probably can work with me, and I should look at a marketplace or a drop shipping type of a strategy. because the world is that's where it's headed, and that's kind of where we are today. Again, like I said, I've been doing this for a lot of years. The best research we can find is that between a quarter and a third of all e-commerce transactions in the U.S. would be considered a virtual supply chain transaction. It would be a marketplace transaction or drop shipping, whatever you want to call it. So it's something that's been growing really big. And if you buy into this idea, it creates a whole new set of challenges. We've moved from this inventory distortion, billions of dollars of things sitting around that is going to be too much or too little and not match the supply to the demand, and we've created it more virtual. That's this next fun stuff. You have pulled the consumer into the supply chain, and the consumer needs product data. They need pictures, descriptions, and things. And in most of these instances, the companies have to coordinate to share this product catalog information. The consumer is going to need to know inventory visibility. You can't have this work unless you have near real-time inventory visibility. How many of these things are there and where are they? And finally, you need to have an ordering process that is somewhat reliable. It's assured. It has to be a consumer order process. It's not the B2B world anymore. It has to be trackable, it has to be returnable, and it has to have this trip assurance so that it actually happens most of the time, 99-something% of the time. So I want to talk 4 quick things, I think, to help solve this problem. The first is, how do you know who to work with on whatever side you're on, but especially from the retail side? How do you know whether somebody can actually do this virtual supply chain? And I think the first way to do that is you just answer the question, do they have a shopping cart? Because if they sell direct to the consumer, they've had to figure out the business model and processes and technology to do those 3 things, catalog, inventory, and orders, specific to a consumer. That probably means that they can do that for you. At least it means they're on the same side of the table as you and live in the same problem. So I think that's your first checklist. If you're looking at vendors and you're thinking about engaging them in this virtual supply strategy and they don't sell to the consumer, I would be much, much more careful in working with those companies because they don't know what they're doing necessarily. After you've kind of done that first filter, then you just test it. I'm surprised how many people put things up for sale on the website that are going to be fulfilled from somebody else and they've never tested anything about it. It's all just on paper or conversations. So you go place an order. Right? You look at the product data, you see how that process goes. Then you're going to receive this order, and you look at the packaging and the shipping expectations and all that stuff. And then you're going to box it back up and send it to them. And so even if you think about, I want to work with 500 vendors, find a $50 product, or even if it's a $100 product, that's a $50,000 outlay of cash, but you're going to get almost all of it back in return anyway. And to not be able to do the test, it completely blows my mind how many people never test that process. Once you've done that, then you have to think about, and if things match up, then you have to think about, this slide is not working. Okay, scorecards. So I don't want to give a huge long list of the 50 things you should have on a scorecard to manage a virtual supply chain. I just want to give kind of 2 foundational things to be aware of. And the first is around product catalog and inventory. And what you want to watch for is change. Your scorecard should be geared around the idea that it's going to change. Products are born into a product life cycle. Products are discontinued and leave from that product life cycle. Things come in stock, things go out of stock. Inventory changes, pricing is being updated. So if your dashboards and scorecards are just watching, when was the last time something changed? And if the answer is not very, too long ago, that's a problem to watch for. Specific to orders, you want to watch for movement. There will be a very discrete order life cycle. An order is placed, an order gets picked up, an order gets accepted by your supply partner, an order is then fulfilled, and when an order gets delivered, it gets returned. As you go through that process, you're looking for lack of movement. Ultimately, at DOBA, we call them problem orders because the consumer is, again, this consumer is pulled up into the supply chain, so if anything goes wrong, you're going to hear about it, but it might take too long. And you can be much more proactive if you monitor things along each step and you can identify potential problems before they become real problems. And at the end of the day, if you're working with the right people, their scorecards are your scorecards. And it's really a consumer scorecard. It's not a B2B. It's not a supply chain issue. It's the consumer in charge. And so I when I find that companies are very open and share that scorecard data. It's not like you have some secret report on your vendor that you're watching and you're going to yell at them when they don't perform. It should be very open and transparent process. Last quick thought on orders. If there is no order movement, then you have a huge problem. And it's back to that churn of suppliers and churn of vendors and churn of SKUs, because if there aren't transactions at the end of the day, then none of this is going to connect together. You can't talk about scorecards without quickly talking about technology. Real fast, you guys you've got to look at building technology applications to run your business in your back office. I'm a huge fan of not building your own technology unless you are a technology company. Why would you build Magento, right? Why would you build these things? So I think you should look at flexible systems, because ultimately the system that today is sending like a PO might need to send an invoice tomorrow once you decide that you bought all this inventory and you're ready to sell it on somebody else's demand channel. And so that need to be flexible leads me down the road of buy flexible systems and platforms so that you don't have to continue to code new stuff all the time. And then on top of having to have your own back office, in this world, you're going to have a huge amount of integrations into other companies. And those are very ad hoc, and it's still the Wild West, and there's some companies and platforms and tools to help with that. The recommendation I would give there is to work with your partner companies and just say, how do you prefer to do data integrations, and try not to recreate the wheel as much as possible. So 3 things kind of at a high level to think about. We've lived in this world of the supply chain for so long, where a retailer has vendors and a supplier has dealers. And that is drastically changing very quickly. And this something to think about in your organization. I think both the word vendor and dealer, they're diminutive words. They're not like, oh, my damn vendors. It's not something you use at a level. And in a virtual distributed type supply chain, and where I think the world is headed, there's so much more partnership thought process that needs to happen. So I think it'd be instructive in your organizations to think about not using those words and talk about partners. It's not about beating up my vendors on price, because in a lot of cases in today's world, you're expecting them to store your inventory and ship it for you. That's not someone you want to pick a fight with. And I think that's something to really consider. The next thing is just take some time to think about your supply side models. I think the hardest part about what nobody tells you about inventory management is it's not one of the first things that all of us that start e-commerce companies think about. It's kind of like, oh crap, it's not nearly as strategically thought through as the demand side. And what's happening, there's so many awesome opportunities to be incredibly innovative on the supply side with this virtualization and the ability to do things in a direct way. And ultimately, those arrows will tip, because a predictive product push supply chain is just massively inefficient. It's trillions of dollars a year inefficient. So there's an opportunity to do that. And the last thing, as much as I talk about virtualization, atoms are greater than bits. If you take it to the logical extreme conclusion and you say the entire supply chain is virtualized, all products somewhat become commodities available, all supply matches up with all demand. So then as entrepreneurs, we have to find new barriers to entry to protect our businesses. And I think more and more that's going to be physical things, physical stores, that function as a showroom with a powerful experience. I think it might be figuring out how to use physical retailers that exist in the world today that, again, are 90% of most product categories as supply sources into online demand channels. And there's some really interesting ways to think about that. I think I have time for a couple questions. And then at the end, I have to run to the airport. I won't be able to talk to anybody today. It's my daughter's 10-year-old birthday today, and I got to get back for her cupcake dinner tonight. So, but Dave said one question.
Awesome question.
Yes.
Okay, so at the beginning you mentioned how it's really horribly inefficient to have all this stuff stockpiled in one place. On the other hand, you can just drop ship directly from vendors. But not all vendors really want to be in the business of doing their own fulfillment, and it's not really their expertise.
Mm-hmm.
So have you found sort of something in between, or are there other kind of bridge models that work that you can speak to?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think there that the answer is there isn't anything really great in between. Somebody has to have that prime directive to do. I think that more and more, and it depends on the category, but more and more, as soon as brands decide to sell direct to the consumer, then that concern goes away. And so, as you watch different product categories, that will continue to play out. So, hopefully twist their arm. But again, if they haven't done that yet, it's likely to not go very well. So, but thank you so much. You can email me anytime, jeremy@dropship.com. If you have other questions, I'm happy to try to help anybody if you're running into challenges in the supply chain. Thanks.